They saw the watch and never gave it a second thought. An old-fashioned compass watch on a high school teacher's wrist during history lessons. Surely just a vintage accessory, but they didn't know what it meant or where it came from. Not yet. They thought he was just another aging teacher, just a man with gray hair and boring lectures, until a visiting veteran caught a glimpse of his wrist and stood at attention. The morning bell echoed through Lincoln High School in suburban Chicago. A typical American public school where teenagers rushed between classes and teachers managed controlled chaos. Rows of lockers lined sterile hallways. Students chatted, laughed, complained about homework, and in room 304, standing at a whiteboard covered with World War II timelines, was a man in khaki pants with his sleeves rolled up and a well-worn leather watch band visible on his left wrist, and Marcus Webb, 56, history teacher, the kind of educator students tolerated but rarely remembered. His shoes were practical but outdated, his lesson plans thorough but uninspiring, his voice steady but unremarkable. He carried no visible signs of his past. He worked nowhere near military installations. His Subaru had teacher parking permits and a "History is not boring" bumper sticker. And aside from one small detail, an antique compass watch with unusual engravings that caught light during hand gestures, he was completely forgettable. "Mr. Webb's watch is weird," one junior muttered to another during a lecture on the Pacific Theater. "Like, who wears a compass on their wrist?" Snickering followed from the back row. Marcus ignored it as he ignored most teenage commentary. He moved through Lincoln High like a dedicated professional. Well respected by the principal who valued his reliability, invisible to the department heads who saw only attendance records, and considered boring but competent by students who needed history credits. He had been teaching at Lincoln High for 6 years. Same schedule every semester. 3 sections of Uchian history, 2 sections of world history, lunch duty on Tuesdays. The faculty knew his coffee order: black, no sugar, but not his real background. The students knew he graded fairly but had no idea where he'd been before appearing in their Chicago suburb. The watch on his wrist seemed like an eccentric teacher affectation, nothing more. That was exactly how Marcus wanted it. Professional. Stable. Safe until Wednesday. It was supposed to be just another lesson on military strategy during World War II. The classroom was its usual mix of engaged students taking notes and distracted ones checking phones under desks. Marcus was explaining the logistics of D-Day landings when the principal knocked and entered with a guest. "Mr. Webb, this is Sergeant Major Richard Chen, retired. He's visiting today as part of our Veterans Day preparation program." "I thought he could observe your class since you're covering World War II." Marcus nodded professionally, gesturing to an empty seat near his desk. "Welcome, Sergeant Major. We're discussing Operation Overlord." Chen moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been tested by decades of service. As he settled into the chair, his eyes swept the classroom with automatic tactical assessment. Exits, windows, potential threats. Then his gaze locked onto Marcus's wrist, the compass watch. Not just vintage, military issue, Ranger Special Operations. The engravings weren't decorative. They were coordinates. Mission markers. Unit designations that only someone with specific clearance would recognize. And Chen's posture changed instantly. He stood, not casually, but with the rigid formality of military protocol. And students looked up, confused by the sudden movement. "Sir," Chen said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of addressing a superior officer. "Permission to speak?" Marcus froze at the whiteboard, marker still raised. 28 teenage faces turned toward him, waiting for his response. He could feel the carefully constructed walls of his civilian identity beginning to crack. "At ease, Sergeant Major," Marcus said quietly, years of command authority bleeding through his teacher persona. "Please, sit down." But Chen remained standing, his eyes never leaving the compass watch. "That timepiece, sir, that's not standard issue." The classroom fell silent. Even the phone-checking students sensed something significant was happening. "It's just an old watch," Marcus replied, lowering his hand. "A family heirloom." With respect, sir, that's a Ranger navigation chronometer. I've only seen 3 of those in my entire career. They were issued to officers during classified operations in... Chen paused, glancing at the students. Well, operations that are still classified. A girl in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Mr. Webb, were you in the military? Marcus set down the marker with deliberate care. The question he'd avoided for 6 years was now unavoidable, asked in front of witnesses who would spread the information throughout the school before lunch period ended. I served, he said simply. And as what? Another student pressed, and Chen answered before Marcus could deflect. If I'm reading those engravings correctly, sir, you were a colonel. Army Rangers, Special Operations Command. His voice carried both respect and disbelief. You led missions that most people will never read about in history books. And the classroom erupted in whispered conversations. Mr. Webb, boring, khaki-wearing Mr. Webb, who made them read 3 chapters a week and write essay responses, had been a colonel? Had led special operations? That's enough, Marcus said, his teacher voice now carrying an edge that made even the most disruptive students fall silent. Sergeant Major Chen, perhaps we could continue this discussion after class? But the damage was done. Students were already texting, the information spreading through the school's social network faster than any lesson Marcus had ever taught. By lunch period, the entire school would know that the quiet history teacher had a hidden military past. And Chen studied Marcus with a professional assessment of someone who understood operational security. My apologies, sir. I didn't mean to compromise your cover. I don't have a cover, Marcus replied, aware that every word was being absorbed by students who would repeat and amplify it. I'm just a teacher now. That watch says different, Chen observed. Those coordinates, I recognize some of them. Afghanistan 2011, the operation that never officially happened. Marcus's jaw tightened. Sergeant Major, with all due respect, there are things that remain classified for good reasons. The bell rang, releasing students who gathered their belongings while maintaining unusual focus on their history teacher. As they filed out, Marcus could hear the speculation beginning. Did you hear? Mr. Webb was like special forces or something. That old watch is from secret missions. He's probably killed people. Like actual combat in Chen remained after the students departed, his expression apologetic but curious. Colonel Webb, I served under General Harrison in Afghanistan. I was there when you pulled off that extraction everyone thought was impossible. You saved 17 lives that night. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. That was a long time ago. I'm not that person anymore. The watch suggests otherwise, sir. You kept it. You wear it every day. That's not forgetting. That's remembering. It's remembering, Marcus agreed quietly, but it's also a reminder of why I left. I teach history now so that students understand the cost of the events I once participated in. That's my contribution now. Chen nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You're teaching them so they don't have to learn the hard way. Exactly. But as Chen left the classroom, Marcus knew that his carefully maintained anonymity was finished. The compass watch had betrayed him, and now the school community would start asking questions he'd spent 6 years avoiding. By the end of the day, the story had evolved through multiple retellings into something approaching legend. Some versions had Marcus leading secret raids in multiple countries. Others claimed he'd been a spy. A few suggested he was still active in classified operations, and teaching was just cover. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more complex. Colonel Marcus Webb had spent 24 years in Army Rangers, specializing in hostage extractions and high-risk operations. He'd seen combat in places that didn't appear on news reports and led missions that would remain classified until long after he was dead. He'd saved dozens of lives and taken others when necessary. And when his wife was diagnosed with cancer, he'd resigned his commission to spend her final 2 years by her side. After she passed, returning to military service felt impossible. The man who'd led soldiers into combat couldn't find the same purpose in a world without the partner who'd anchored his civilian identity. Teaching had seemed like a way to serve without fighting, to contribute without returning to the life that had cost him time with his dying wife. The compass watch was all he'd kept. A reminder of lives saved and missions accomplished, but also of the price paid for service. He wore it not as a badge of honor, but as a memento mori. A reminder that all service, all sacrifice, all duty came with costs that couldn't be undone. Now that reminder had exposed him, and Marcus would have to decide whether to embrace the recognition or find a new place to hide from a past that refused to stay buried. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Lincoln High to find his classroom transformed. Someone had printed and posted historical photos, Rangers in combat, military medals, operational insignia. On his desk sat a handmade sign, "Real history taught here by someone who lived it." Principal Davidson was waiting in the hallway. "Marcus, we need to talk about yesterday's incident." Marcus prepared for the conversation about maintaining professional boundaries and not disrupting the educational environment. Instead, Davidson surprised him. "The students are engaged in a way I've never seen. 3 kids came to my office this morning asking about military service options. 5 more requested transfers into your classes. The history department enrollment for next semester has tripled." And Marcus stared at the decorations in his classroom. "This isn't what I wanted." "Maybe not, but it's what these kids need." Davidson gestured to a group of students gathering near the door. "They've spent their lives learning history from textbooks written by people who never experienced it. You've lived the things they're studying. That matters." The first period bell rang. Students filed in with unusual energy, taking seats and actually pulling out notebooks before being asked. In the back row, a typically disengaged senior raised his hand. "Mr. Webb, Colonel Webb, can you tell us about what it was really like? The actual experience of being in those operations?" Marcus looked at his compass watch, the coordinates catching morning light. He'd worn it every day as a private reminder, never intending it to become public knowledge. But perhaps Chen had been right. Keeping it meant he hadn't truly left that life behind. "And I'll make you a deal," Marcus said. "I'll share some experiences, appropriately edited for classification and age appropriateness. But in exchange, you engage seriously with the historical material. You understand that every war, every conflict, every military operation involves real people making impossible choices." The students nodded with genuine interest. "And you never romanticize it." "What I did was necessary, sometimes heroic, but never glorious. Real combat isn't like movies. It's complicated, morally ambiguous, and it changes everyone who experiences it." Deal? Several students responded simultaneously. Marcus began the lesson differently than he'd taught in 6 years. Instead of dry recitation of facts and dates, he connected historical events to the human experience of those who lived them. When discussing D-Day, he talked about the fear soldiers felt before hitting the beaches. When covering Vietnam, he acknowledged the complexity of fighting a war that divided the nation. When teaching about recent conflicts, he spoke carefully about the weight of leadership and the cost of decisions made under pressure. The compass watch became a teaching tool rather than a hidden artifact. He'd reference it when discussing navigation in unfamiliar territory, both literal and metaphorical. Students began to understand that history wasn't just facts to memorize, but human experiences to learn from. And word of Marcus's teaching evolution spread beyond Lincoln High. By the end of the week, the Chicago Tribune ran a story. Decorated Army Ranger now teaching history to Chicago teens. The article included photos of the compass watch and quotes from students about how their perspective on history had changed. Marcus found himself fielding interview requests, speaking invitations, and questions from other teachers about how to make history relevant. The attention was exhausting for someone who'd chosen teaching specifically to avoid recognition. Friday afternoon, after a week of increased scrutiny and engagement, Marcus sat alone in his classroom staring at the compass watch. The coordinates engraved on its face marked missions he couldn't discuss, places he couldn't name, decisions that still haunted quiet moments. A knock interrupted his reflection. Sergeant Major Chen stood in the doorway. "Permission to enter, Colonel?" Marcus gestured him in. "I'm not a colonel anymore. Just a teacher." Chen settled into a student desk. "I've been thinking about what happened last week. I apologized for exposing your past, but I'm not sure I should have. These kids needed to know that history isn't abstract. You've given them something textbooks never could. I gave them a narrative that makes war seem more personal. That could encourage enlistment without full understanding of consequences. An or Chen countered. You've given them context that helps them make informed decisions. You're not glorifying service, you're humanizing it. That's valuable. Marcus looked at the classroom decorations his students had created, maps marked with battle locations, and timelines connecting historical events to current situations. Questions about the human cost of military conflicts. They're actually learning, he admitted, not just memorizing for tests, but engaging with the material in ways that suggest genuine understanding. Because you stopped hiding, Chen said. That watch you wear every day, it's not just a reminder for you. North, it's a bridge between the history you teach and the history you lived. Marcus rotated his wrist, watching the compass needle settle toward north. I left the military to get away from that life. I didn't want to be defined by it anymore, but you brought the watch. You couldn't entirely leave it behind. My wife gave me this before my last deployment. She said it would help me find my way home. Marcus's voice roughened with memory. It did, but she wasn't there when I arrived. Cancer took her while I was teaching at the War College, preparing for another assignment. So you left. Found a different way to serve. I thought teaching would let me contribute without the weight of command, without responsibility for lives in immediate danger. Marcus gestured to the classroom. But these students' futures are shaped by what they learn here. That's a different kind of responsibility, but it's still life and death in its own way. Chen stood to leave, then paused. Colonel Marcus, what you're doing now matters. Those 17 lives I mentioned that you saved in Afghanistan? I was one of them. I got to come home, start a family, grow old. Hang because of you. Now you're potentially saving more lives by teaching these kids to think critically about conflict, service, and history. After Chen left, Marcus remained in the empty classroom as afternoon light shifted across the maps and timelines his students had created. The compass watch pointed north, as it always did, but Marcus realized he'd been misunderstanding its purpose. It wasn't just a reminder of past service or a memorial to his wife. It was a navigational tool for finding purpose in different terrain. He'd thought leaving the military meant leaving behind his identity as a leader and protector. But teaching was another form of both. The coordinates engraved on the watch face marked places where he'd led soldiers through danger. The classroom he now occupied was where he led students through the intellectual and moral complexities of understanding that danger. Different mission. Same core purpose, and Marcus picked up a marker and began preparing Monday's lesson plan. Not the dry recitation he'd been teaching, but an exploration of how ordinary people make extraordinary choices under pressure. He'd use examples from his own experience where appropriate, always emphasizing the human cost and moral complexity. The compass watch ticked steadily on his wrist, keeping time as he transformed from a teacher hiding from his past into an educator integrating it with his present. Outside room 304, students gathered in small groups discussing the week's lessons. For the first time in their academic experience, history felt relevant. The boring teacher with the weird watch had become someone who made the past feel connected to their present and future, and Monday morning would bring new questions, new curiosity, new engagement. Marcus Webb, teacher, colonel, widower, guardian of difficult truths, would be ready to guide them through history not as abstract facts, but as human experiences that shaped the world they were inheriting. The compass watch would help him navigate that mission, just as it had guided him through countless operations in hostile territories. Different terrain, but the core mission remained, leading others safely through dangerous ground toward understanding that could save lives. Some watches just tell time. Marcus Webb's watch told stories, marked missions, and now served as a bridge between the history he'd lived and the future he was helping students imagine. If this story moved you, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden heroes walking among us. What do you think makes a good teacher? Drop your theories in the comments.